Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Instant Insights podcast. At GlobalData Strategic Intelligence, we track over 100 tech, industry, ESG, and macro themes that impact all major sectors. I'm your host, Holly Anness-Bradshaw, and today I'm joined by Chris Bellamy, who is a biodesigner and founder of sports nutrition brand Yanaa. In this episode, we'll cover Chris's extensive design background and talk about how to design for sustainability, collaborating with nature, and what he has learned from his interspecies and intercultural collaborations. So, thank you for joining us, Chris. I heard you talk a few months ago at Central St. Martin's here in London and was incredibly inspired by your work. So, it's a pleasure to get to talk to you again. Before your life as a biodesigner, you covered everything from EVs to recyclable shoes. So, do you mind giving our listeners a bit of background on yourself before we jump into the kind of like nature aspect of everything?
Yeah, for sure. I grew up on a little small holding in Worcestershire, and I grew up. My grandparents were farmers, and my parents were doctors. My brother became a vet, so very much this family centered around the soil and human health, and I broke that mold. I had a really great physics teacher at school, and he persuaded me to go and study engineering. So I went to go and study engineering at the University of Cambridge, which was absolutely amazing. I had no idea what an engineer was at the time, but slowly I finally I worked it out, and I started my career having an amazing time designing. Uh, Climbing equipment was my first job up in North Wales. Then I was at Jaguar Land Rover designing their electric vehicle, the I-Pace, which at its time was a revolutionary project, and we were 300 engineers locked in an office, away from everyone else, so we could think freely about reinventing the car. So it was an amazing experience, but it was very the project was entirely centered around reducing the impact of a car, and so every single watt, gram, drop of energy was measured and calculated. We really turned the car into an equation of efficiency. Then I was very lucky to move over to Canada, where we had a footwear business where we were developing recyclable and customizable footwear. And that then took me eventually to Salomon, the footwear brand, the outdoor brand Salomon in France, where again the shift there in sustainability moved more towards durability rather than recyclability, because it was identified that actually the main issue with recyclable products was that you saw an incremental reduction in the impact of the materials, but that the reduction came at the cost of, firstly, the performance of the product. There was quite a significant reduction in product performance. And secondly, actually was limited by the rate at which people recycled them. And in the case of the product that I developed, no one ever actually recycled it. And I think the most well-known example from Adidas of their recyclable shoe, that I think only 10% of people in the studies they published, only 10% of people ever actually recycled that shoe. So it became the real blocker. Was same with the electric car. We spent years developing it, and at the end of the day, it had the same impact as a diesel car. And partly that was down because of the type of electricity being used and how that electricity is produced. But it also came down to the human element. When someone drives an electric car, it's really fun to drive, and so people drive it like a go-kart. The tire wear on an electric car is twice as fast as the tire wear on a normal car. Partly that's because of the heavy battery, but the other part of it's because people love to accelerate really fast and drive really quickly. So I think, it's been a really interesting journey for me, because I did all of this work in engineering at the cutting edge of sustainability, and then 4 years ago, had went through the process that probably a lot of people have thought through, a lot of creatives have thought through, of I'm a engineer or designer and I'm trained how to make stuff. And that is, the world doesn't need more stuff. And so I said, how can I approach this differently? And my conclusion was that there were two limitations to what I'd been working on. The first one was the materials, where the metals and plastics, even if we were recycling them, were still, only a few percentage points better than the virgin materials. And they were just fundamentally the wrong kind of materials for us to be working with. And so I looked at organic materials, natural materials. I looked at the thought experiment of a tree. We could never engineer anything as elegant or beautiful or remarkable as a tree, with all of its, water transport systems and energy transport systems, and the ability for it to produce tens of thousands of solar panels every single year and then drop them for wind protection in the winter. Just the most remarkable thing that we could never repeat that material, with the kind of human or the anthropogenic materials that we're working with. And so that was the first point, was changing the materials. The other point was around the human side. So that, most of the projects I'd worked on, while they were technically excellent, they generally always failed due to a human problem. Whether that was how someone was driving a car, or whether that was someone choosing to recycle their shoe or not. And so that was how, for me, I came into this field of biodesign, because I said I wanted to work with biological materials, and I wanted to work with, in the arts, with creativity, because it's through this emotional lens that we can really start to encourage people to change their behaviors. In every product there is a rational and there is an irrational, and and for me, the irrational is where we can really start to drive people to make significant changes to their behaviors and in what they're doing. So yeah, for me, the arts
Yeah.
is key to that.
Yeah, it's great. I've just been writing about the circular economy. So that kind of whole, we don't need more stuff, but people still need to be creative and want to do something with the world. So how can you do that in a sustainable way? Um, so you mentioned you're a biodesigner now. Do you mind giving our listeners a bit of a quick definition on what you mean by that? And kind of, we covered this a bit, but the leap of going into working with nature and living things.
So biodesign is this emerging discipline that has really grown over the last 10 years. It is a very broad field and it can be interpreted in many different ways. So it is, anything that involves creativity and nature. That's how I like to think about it. And there's so many different interpretations. For some people, it can be around biomimicry and around, learning from nature. For me, I find that a little bit extractive of, nature's intellectual property. So I much prefer to think of it of collaborating with nature. But it covers anything from, biomaterials to bio-inspired design to, anything connected to nature and the environment and the arts around it.
Going off of that, one of the things you've done so far has been working with bioluminescent algae that ended up on the runway at Paris Fashion Week. You helped design a dress that was on Iris Van Herpen's show in 2025. Can you tell us a bit about where this came from, the working with the bioluminescent algae, how Iris Van Herpen came into this? And one of the things I loved hearing you talk about was you wrote a job description for the algae. How did that exercise kind of change the way you look at natural resources and how you work with them?
So the work with bioluminescent algae came about. I started studying biodesign at Central St Martin's, and one of the first assignments they gave us was this project to define what is life.
Yeah.
And what is life? I got stuck on that first assignment. I became absolutely fascinated by this state of livingness and how remarkable the state of livingness was, how it can adapt, heal, respond, repair, react. And as part of that, I came across this subject of bioprospecting, where people are looking for remarkable materials or organisms in nature. Because what people say is that for every one microorganism that we know at the moment, we have 100,000 microorganisms that we don't know about. And they call
Yeah.
this biological dark matter. And within this biological dark matter, there may be vaccines, drugs, and treatments, new kinds of materials that we haven't even possibly imagined. And so I got fascinated by this. And one of the places where there is a lot of bioprospecting activity is in French Polynesia in the Pacific, because these novel organisms are generally hiding in places that we haven't been to before or where there's quite extreme environments. And when I went out there, we did some bioprospecting. We found some really amazing microorganisms, but I realized that it's was it I was doing I was undertaking an incredibly colonial activity. I was a white dude turning up on a Polynesian island, taking some genetic samples, sequencing it to try and find some, biological organisms that I could go and exploit.
Mhm.
And I was very much repeating the mistakes of the past. And so I then flipped the project completely on its head, completely upside down. I said, okay, what if we could instead, how can I facilitate the local community to work with their own organisms around the island?
Yeah.
And one of the challenges is that most microorganisms, generally what they do is they're just slimy. They're slimy, they make slimes and they're interesting slimes, but it's hard to be relevant to daily life. So to engage with the local community, I said, well, what's the most exciting organism that I can find here that we can work with? And in the lagoons in Polynesia, this very similar to actually what we get around the UK, but in certain conditions, the water lights up with bioluminescence. And so I
Mhm.
said, okay, to start this as a first project with the local community, let's take these bioluminescent algae and let's explore how, with the local community, we can make a material which then allows to be this living material that the local community can work with. And so that was how we ended up with working with the bioluminescent algae, working with the local community, and I ended up working with local artisans and exploring what they could do with this bioluminescent material. So we made a drum that when the drum was beaten, it would illuminate. We made a collier, like a necklace, that every time someone breathed, the necklace would illuminate. And we made a swimsuit. Which one of the artisans, he was a night fisherman. His family did a lot of night fishing, and he'd lost several family members because it's a very dangerous thing to go and do, free diving at night, hunting after fish. And so he said, could I make a swimsuit that illuminates to keep us safe at night? And I think it was that caught the eye of Iris van Herpen. And
Yeah.
she reached out and she asked if we could create something and collaborate together for Paris Fashion Week in 2025.
Amazing. And yeah, a bit about the job description of the algae, how you use it, and how did that make you
Yeah.
think differently about using I think natural resources of everything is about agricultural kind of resources, but we don't really consider what using that and exploiting it means for the resource itself. We think, oh, it's just there, we can keep growing it, but especially with the algae, it is a living thing. So yeah,
Uh,
where did that kind of exercise come in and how did it kind of change how you thought about using it?
yeah, absolutely. So it came when I'd just done my bioprospecting trip to French Polynesia. I'd
Mhm.
met all of the local communities, but I'd come back with my biological samples and they were being sequenced to identify, novel organisms. And obviously at that point, I, have this reflection about, what I'm doing, not being, very forward thinking in terms of, recreating the mistakes of the past in quite a colonial way. And so it came as part of that rethinking process. So one of it was about how do I engage with the local community,
Yeah.
which I've just talked about. The other half of that was about how do I work with this organism in a respectful manner. And to design with a living organism is incredibly hard.
Mm.
Even our own, so even with our own species, we really struggle to interact and get on with our own species. So
Yeah.
interacting with other organisms is going to be even more challenging. And so I really wanted to explore the ethical aspects of how do we, I wanted to explore these ethical aspects of how do I work responsibly with other organisms. And so did a series of design experiments. So, for example, to understand better the bioluminescent algae, I made a collection of jewelry so that contained the algae, and they require very similar conditions to us humans. They require a nice stable temperature. They require regular sunshine, so they need about 8 to 12 hours of light a day, and 8 to 12 hours of darkness a day. So they need sleeping, to sleep in a way. They need regular motion, and so for me, one of the ways of doing that was putting them into this jewelry so that I could live with the algae.
Mhm.
And that was a really amazing experiment because if I work too hard, if I work too much, then the algae would die. And so they
Yeah.
became this, wonderful sort of co-living with the algae, which really helped me understand their behaviors and their needs, which made then, designing with them later on a lot easier. And then the other one, for example, the other design experiment that you were referencing there about the job description was me, really exploring this idea of why we're doing this collaboration. And with all of the Polynesian collaborators that I worked with, I didn't have any money for this project. I didn't have any funding. And so every collaboration, there was this very, obvious example or obvious framing of, well, what's in it for them? What's in it for me and what's in it for them? And I was doing it because I was passionate and cared about it and was interested in it. But I was constantly aware of, what's in it for these guys. And so, whether that was making sure they were credited correctly, making sure that it was reflecting their interests and their curiosities. And I think that then spread over into the algae, where I was, started to reflect and say, well, what's in it for the algae here? And, yes, they're a single-celled organism, and yes, people like to say that, they don't experience pain, therefore they're not, we don't consider them sentient, therefore, we don't consider them an animal, and ethics therefore aren't relevant. But from my perspective, I'd spent time living with these algae in jewelry, and I was very aware that this, the emission of light is in some ways a stress response. The similar to the way we produce adrenaline at a time of flight or flight. The algae are producing the light as a deterrent mechanism to distract and to attract bigger predators to the ones that are trying to eat them. And so it is a form of stress response. And so, okay, I'm asking this algae to be under stress for me. And it was a really important reflection to say, well, what does that mean for the algae? Would I want to do that? And I think it's a very interesting reflection now, where in the work I'm doing, whenever I'm working with anyone, in an element, I'm asking them to put themselves under stress. And
Yeah.
what am I asking for? What am I giving in exchange for that? So yeah, that was the experiment with the job description.
Nice. So you spoke about working with kind of research scientists and in the indigenous population in French Polynesia. What were some of the most important lessons you learned from this kind of cross collaboration between yourself, scientists, the indigenous peoples who have lived in that environment for millennia? What kind of did you take from all of that?
Yeah, there were some amazing insights that came from working with them. I think the thing that stood out to me most was that the community there was so open to working on something new and different and innovative. So when I said, we're going to make a bioluminescent textile and we're going to design objects with it, the local community there, they got it straight away. They said, "Whoa, this is about symbiosis and this is so
Yeah.
cool and let's make this and let's make that." And yet when I came back to the UK and presented it to the laboratories I was partnering with, so I did it in collaboration with the Francis Crick Institute in London. And when I
Yeah.
came back and presented it to the scientists and the people in Europe, people said, "You're crazy, you're mad, this is ridiculous, why are you doing this? This is stupid." And so I think it was really interesting to see that contrast in openness to the idea. And the Polynesian people explained it to me as follows, where their culture comes from voyaging.
Yeah.
They voyaged to Polynesia. They voyaged from French Polynesia onto Hawaii. They travel these huge thousands of kilometers by sea at night with no navigation systems. They only had the stars. And so there's this deep-rooted belief in Polynesian culture that it's in the night, it's in the dark where you find your direction, because that's when the stars come out, that's when you can navigate. In the
Yeah.
daytime, you're lost. And so for them, this innovation is inherent to their culture because it's in the new and the unknown where you find the future. And so that was just such a powerful learning. And also the other really interesting learning was around how we treat knowledge. And because I was dealing with these living materials, we talked about life and livingness a lot with my collaborators out there. And they highlighted a lot how in their indigenous knowledge, their traditional knowledge is transmitted orally. It's shared by speaking to each other, by telling stories. And as a result, it's constantly evolving, it's constantly changing, it's constantly adapting. Whereas our Western culture is that we want to try and write everything down. We want to try and record everything. And when we do that, in their eyes, it's the knowledge dies. It becomes a relic. It
Not
becomes
part of me.
preserved. And so this observation of the difference between living knowledge and dead or static knowledge, and actually the power of having spoken word, shared traditions, whatever it might be. That was the other thing that really I came away with, which is all aligned around this spirit of livingness and this state of livingness where something is alive, whether that's a material or knowledge, and how important that is.
Yeah. So I get you spoke about the voyaging there. Is that where kind of the initial spark of Yanaa came to you? So Yana's your sports nutritional brand for our listeners. Yeah, where did kind of that idea come from and how has it been growing over the last year or so?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think again from this worry about creating stuff, and the world doesn't need more stuff.
Mhm.
Um, there are a few things that we do need. We will always have to eat,
Yeah.
and our food system is responsible for about a third of our global emissions.
Mhm.
It's also responsible for our health, and we have both at the moment, a planetary crisis and a health crisis going on. And so Yana was born from that, where we look at our food system, and our food system has really, suffered from this scientific reductionism. Our, food system now, promotes, a certain grams of protein or a certain, grams of carbohydrate, and it simplifies food down into its very, essential forms. It's been reduced into just numbers, and yet food is so much more than just numbers. It's got yes, it's got the macronutrients, but it's also got all of the micronutrients. It's got all of the antioxidants, the polyphenols. It's also got the histories. It's got the human connection. It's food is about so much more than just numbers. And food is something that's essential. And I think that's why, for me, I was very attracted to working in, with food as a space. I decided to tackle the kind of the pinnacle of I guess anthropogenic food, which is
Yeah.
sports nutrition. It's where we've taken food and we've really transformed it into fuel. And there's this mindset among athletes that the body is a machine, and that I put fuel into the machine and that generates energy. And this was so opposed to all of the research I was doing into biodesign, ecological thinking, living materials. And while the work I was doing on bioluminescent living materials is quite speculative and far out, and it'll be probably 20 years before anything like that is technologically possible at scale. Our food industry is happening right now. And in terms of
Yeah.
biotechnology, our food industry is the most advanced biotechnological industry we have on our planet. The ability for bread to be baked in 50,000 bakeries across France, making 27 million baguettes every single day, using, everyone using their own yeast. That is for me a biotechnological miracle.
Mm.
And so I think the food industry is incredibly advanced in terms of the use of biotechnologies. And so for me, it's about working with athletes, working with the pinnacle of reductionism in sports, and trying to challenge that and say, okay, what if we were to treat the human body as a living organism instead of a machine? What if we were
Yeah.
to say that actually it's the health and nourishment of the human body which leads to performance, not the putting of fuel into a motor and an engine? And that is what we're trying to do at Yanaa. And Yanaa is an acronym for "You Are Not an Astronaut." And the whole philosophy is around not eating space food, but also not taking things too seriously. Being a bit more human about how we approach sport, and also looking after this planet, because there's a lot of talk about interplanetary travel at the moment,
Mm.
and we're trying to encourage people to explore this planet with the same curiosity and wonder with which you'd explore another planet. Because we think that this planet's got a lot of potential still.
So, before we finish, do you have any final words of wisdom for our listeners about working alongside nature and kind of avoiding resource exploitation?
I think it's incredibly hard, and it's very easy to slip into an argument around degrowth. And I
Yeah.
think, my solution when I was a designer and engineer working with, recycled materials and so on, it was increasingly uncomfortable, where increasingly you'd say, you know what, this just doesn't work. And you get to the point where you say degrowth is the only option. We've just got to do less, not exist, buy less stuff.
Mhm.
Whereas I think what I've realized is that working with nature, um, the nature living things are the only things which can defy entropy. So entropy is this principle where um, we are constantly moving towards a state of disorder. So structure will descend into disorder. That's the principle of entropy. That's what's happening in our universe, and that's the physical principle that guides our material world. But life is one of the only things. This is how Schrödinger, the physicist, is how he just defined life. Was he said that life is the only thing that can defy entropy. It's the only thing that can create structure from disorder. And so for me, what inspires me at the moment is thinking about how, as a living thing, how can I create structure and beauty from the chaos that's around me?
Yeah.
And doing so, with living things, with living materials, whether that's growing some vegetables in my garden from the disordered soil, whether that's planting a hedgerow in a field that, becomes this amazing ecosystem and creates beautiful structures, or, designing a living material. Um, so so yeah, that's really, the philosophy I found right now, and I find that incredibly empowering and very inspiring.
That's great. Is Yanaa the top priority at the moment, or are you still kind of experimenting with other things at the moment?
Yana's the priority. It's a project that's in the now. It is in the present. We're trying to sell these savory real food sports nutrition products to get
Yeah.
athletes eating real food again for their health, for the planet, for their happiness. We're trying to break down the belief that the human body is a machine. And so I'm obviously still continuing my design work, and I've got some really exciting materials working with plants at the moment. I'm trying to explore the how we can maybe make a medium ground where we can make some living materials that people can really interact with on a daily basis. But Yana is very much the what should I call it? The trenches. That's the battle that we can fight here and now, and it's getting a great reception, but there's a hell of a lot of work to do with it.
Yeah. Well, it's such a great time to do sports nutrition. I feel like everyone is running and pushing themselves to the extreme. So it's great to kind of have something that's not sugary and overly manufactured and kind of doing more harm than good, I guess. But
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, absolutely.
But yeah, so thank you, Chris, for those instant insights. It's been great to talk to you. You can find out more about Global Data Reports and Chris's work in the episode description. Thanks all for listening, and for us in Strategic Intelligence, we'll see you next time.